one sees a lot of articles these days in the professional press about whether anyone or any entity will take over the watchdog role of American newspapers when it comes to covering local government, state legislatures. And I'm very pessimistic about that because in my home in rural Pennsylvania, when the paper, which was owned by Murdoch at the time, had to cut back, they quit covering the township meetings. And those are the biggest center of graft in Pennsylvania politics because they handle zoning cases. And that example, I think, radiates throughout our civic life. I've covered every element of local and state government from the county commission in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, up through the Georgia, Florida, Alabama legislatures. And many times I was the only outside witness, particularly to these smaller bodies of city commissioners and county commissioners. Now, people are losing that. They regard it as a benefit, but in fact, when you stop patronizing your newspaper with your advertising circulation, that's one of the services that disappears first. Is there an increase in corruption as a result of the lack of newspaper coverage? Common sense tells you yes. As someone who covered government in Alabama and now lives in Pennsylvania, two of the most corrupt state governments in the country, it's hard for me to see how they could increase very much. And that's not a facetious answer. I mean, if you look at the conduct of these legislatures, it's pretty flagrant. But as I said, I think at the local level, that's where the real danger lurks initially, is the little things, the sewage contracts, the garbage truck sales, the police uniforms. That's where you're going to see a proliferation of kickbacks and evasion of public competitive bidding laws, I think. No, actually, at the time I covered Florida legislature, it was not. But they had a lot of Democrats back then, and they were very discreet about how they stole. I think about 35 to 40% of the American people believe that very firmly. That's Fox's target demographic, and they're doing very well with it. I think there's a ceiling on that, and the ceiling is imposed by the fact that papers like the New York Times, quality broadcast outlets, high-end digital publications appeal to the most educated, most affluent media audience in world history. So I think there's a limit to how far you can go with an idea that an entity that appeals to 1/3 of the audience is absolutely right about a certain set of issues and the rest of the world is wrong. No, the 1/3 would be the Fox audience. Yeah. No, I think there's a natural ceiling on that audience. And I think that's one of the things we saw in the election. Much lower employment, fewer mid-sized papers. I think you'll see some small-town papers do pretty well. I think the real struggle is going to be in places like Gainesville, Mobile, mid-sized cities, which traditionally have been very profitable newspaper towns. I don't see how they can continue that. Put it simply, American newspapers have lost 20% of their advertising in the last few years. Journalism is labor intensive. If you don't have ad revenues, you can't hire the reporters who serve the local information needs. So that's kind of a whirlpool. Learn to count. Take economics. And you can look at the figures yourself. They're, in fact, in USA Today. By 2016, annual advertising on television will be over about $75 billion a year. Annual advertising on newspapers, on digital, will be approaching $40 billion a year. And annual advertising on newspapers will be approached at about $30 billion a year and headed down. Now, that doesn't say journalists should follow advertising and what they report. It says you've got to work for people who have the money to pay for your skill. So I would say go toward digital broadcast journalism, or I think as for Oscar season, if I were a young writer today, I think I would try to go in the movie business. I don't think so, so far. I'm very proud of that fact. The Times has always had the best staff in the country. It did in the print age. That advantage is more so now that other newspapers have dropped away. But again, we've got to look at the economics. The New York Times newsroom budget is about $200 million a year. The Times website, which is the best newspaper website I've seen, took in last year only $90 million. So that website covers less than half of their newsroom budget. That's a situation that sooner or later will start impacting your journalistic payroll and therefore your journalistic quality. The best one that didn't get away was my wife, who was an avid fisherman too. In my book, The One That Got Away, I wrote about a marlin that I hooked on Christmas Island in the South Pacific, and it got away after 7 hours, and by the end of that time I was pulling for it.